I'm Sandra Hindman, the owner of the gallery Les Illuminators. We're in Paris, Chicago, New York, also London. And I asked Christopher de Hamel, who works with us and who's also a librarian, just ex-librarian at Cambridge University, professor at Cambridge University, world-renowned specialist in medieval manuscripts, writer of meetings with remarkable manuscripts, if he could come up with a clever idea for doing something during the book fair. And he came up with this clever idea, a walking tour of the book trade in medieval Paris, which both of us probably have taught in our schools. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Christopher, because we're really standing on the street where they lived, as it were. It sounds like My Fair Lady now. Yeah. So, okay, Christopher.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I have to say, I am passionately interested in the whole business of medieval book production. How they made books, who they were, where they lived, they were real people, how it operated, how it worked. I wrote my thesis 40 years ago on the beginnings of the book trade in Paris, subject that interests me immensely. I thought what we'd do is talk a little bit about this street here, and then we'll go across the Petit Pont and up the Rue Saint-Jacques, and we'll look again at the second site up there, where many of the really great illuminated manuscripts in Paris were made. They began this building, they were building Notre-Dame in the 1160s, and in 1164 they pulled down all the houses that were built around here, between the Royal Palace down there and the cathedral here, and they built this street, known then as the Rue Neuve Notre-Dame, the new street of Notre-Dame. And the explanation, the traditional explanation, the reason for putting the houses down is that they could get stone up for the building of the cathedral. Now, in practice, surely they would have had a harbour down there, and they'd have brought the stone in by water. However, the reason for doing it, the bishop, Maurice de Sully, created this street to provide access to Notre-Dame. And this is just at that moment when learning is moving away from the monasteries and into the secular world. And in Paris, first place in Europe, you begin to get learning around the Victorine house, the Augustinian house of Saint Victor, and learning in the cathedral. Peter Abelard was teaching in here in the 1140s, and learning that monopoly of learning, which has been Benedictine for 1,000 years, is moving away and into the secular world. And our little card you've got shows the houses that were in the street here, and on the corner here is the Hôtel Dieu. Well, according to this plaque, is the Hôtel Dieu, which must be approximately, well, it must be roughly where that entrance is now. It's now moved over there. That's where it is now. But clearly it was built here. And then our little card shows about 4 houses down on each side here. And the second house along, which by my calculation would have been about here, was occupied in the beginning of the 13th century by somebody called Alexander the Parchmenter. Now, a parchmenter is not somebody who makes parchment, but who sells it. And it is assumed, this is before there are any bookshops anywhere in Europe, it's assumed that a parchmenter is somebody who is dealing with the business of the book trade. So he is both selling parchment, but he's also probably selling books. And it is very interesting that both in Oxford and Paris, which are the best documented places for the book trade, the parchment has come first. They can't be selling blank parchment only. They're clearly dealing with the whole business of the book. And Alexander's house, I say, was about here. He was married. His wife was called Evelina. So he's secular. He's moved away from the monastery. And his neighbour, I don't actually know which side, but for convenience, let's say on this side, was called Adam. So there were 2 of them, Alexander and Adam, both parchmenters working here in the beginning of the 13th century. Now there is a famous 2-volume Bible in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and across the Genesis page, right across the double opening, it says, "Magister Alexander may fecit." Master Alexander made me. And it is the first, this Master Alexander is the first Paris illuminator, secular illuminator, whose name is known. And the manuscript is signed at the end by a scribe called Adam. Now, I don't know, we don't know, it is not known if Adam the parchmenter and Adam Alexander the parchmenter are those two people, but it is very likely. And it's that very crisp, clear style before the Bible Morales, a crisp style of about 1220, 1215, and it's very, very likely that it was illuminated exactly here.
And let me interrupt just to say that although the book trade was centered here and in this area where we're going to go very close, they did not make the parchment here because it was so like smelly and horrible and icky, and they made it out near where the abattoirs are, so outside of Paris, and then brought it in. So the messy parts of the book trade happened elsewhere.
And one of the interesting things there's a study going on in York University at the moment on the making of parchment in 13th century Paris, is what they're concentrating on. And they're taking DNA out of parchment from Paris in the 13th century. And what is so interesting with those little 13th century Bibles, for example, which were made in the street, is how different the animals were. It's not all cow or all sheep, but a complete mixture, and anyone making a book is going to muddle up those animals. So in other words, the supply of parchment is not coming from one place, but coming from a multiple place and being sold through the parchmenters. Now, Alexander of here had died by 1231, and his house at this point was taken over by Baudouin the parchmenter, and his wife was called Isabel, so again we know a bit about them. Clearly he didn't own the house. It must have belonged to Alexander's executors, because Raoul Joseph then takes it over, who was the executor to Alexander, and there is a wonderful glossed Genesis and Exodus in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which I looked at 40 years ago when I was being a student, with the name of Raoul the parchmenter on the flyleaf. So that again is a glossed book being made here. Now clearly they're in a very good position. They're right between the Royal Palace and the cathedral. They made a lot of money, and Raoul and his wife left £70 to Notre-Dame on their death to commemorate their anniversary. So clearly it's a successful business. The third house along, the one beyond Alexander, about where the girl with the dark glasses is standing, was owned by the 1250s by Nicholas Lombard, presumably an Italian, and he was the first. He is called a bookseller. So for the first time they're beginning to run a kind of bookshop, and his house is described as next to that of the late Alexander the Parchmenter. So my guess is somewhere down about there. And there's an 11-volume Bible surviving, made for Guy de la Tour, also in the Bibliothèque Nationale, with his name on the flyleaf. So again, we know of a manuscript which is being made by him. And he clearly made a lot of money, and then he bought Alexander's house, which was here in 1254, when we have a description of it as having 4 stories. So big house. The family would have lived behind, the shop would have been at the front. And Nicolas Lombard, again, married man. His first wife was called Beatrice. She died in the mid-1250s, and he then married again a woman called Annalisa, and they had a daughter called Odilette. So again, brought up here. Now, the first house in the row, the one down probably about where we are standing now, I'm assuming that was owned by Adam, but by the end of the 13th century, the Lescurel family were here and remained here for over 100 years. The first recorded woman is Alice de Lescurel, the widow of Martin, who was himself an illuminator, and the house was still there. They were still there in the 1340s, and eventually the house belonged to Jean Le Pelletier, whose daughter married the printer Simon Vost. So the printers were here. Printers were on this site in the early 16th century. Now back to the middle house, Alexander's house, about where the photographer is now. By 1291, that was owned by Jean de Saint-Père au But, also described as a bookseller, and he and his wife Jean rented the shop from the Hotel Dieu down here. They owned the house behind, but they rented the shop at the front. So clearly the front row front road here belonged to the Hotel Dieu. They own the house at the back. And by 1338, they have sold out to Thomas de Maubeuge, and he is one of the great booksellers of 14th century Paris. He was a libraire, so a licensed bookseller, licensed by the university, down up the Rue Saint-Jacques up there, and there were 4 licensed booksellers who were authorized to trade in books for the university, and he is one of them. So he's one of the 4 principal booksellers of the university. But he's also wonderfully positioned between the Royal Palace and the cathedral, and he was very, very successful. In 1313, he was selling romances, literary texts to Mahaut d'Artois, one of the great women book collectors of the early 14th century, including a Saint's Life and a Vœux des Ponts, the Vows of the Peacock. In 1328, she commissioned him to provide choir books, breviaries for her chapel, and she bought from him a Bible in French, for which she paid £100. In 1328. His name also occurs in a Grand Chronique in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and there are also records of him in the French Royal Account. So in 1327, he's selling books to the king, and in 1349, he sold a moralized Bible to the Duke of Normandy, afterwards the King Jean le Bon. So clearly, direct line. The kings are coming backwards and forwards to the cathedral, buying books as they go past. His wife was called Berthe, and she was herself the widow of a bookseller. On the other side of the street here, we haven't got such precise placing of where people are. There's a marvelous, there's a Justinian manuscript in the Staatsbibliothek in Gießen in Germany with an inscription, with an advertisement, first advertisement we have of the book trade, by presumably a bookseller called Ernie le Romanceur, the romance writer, somewhere over this side, who gives his address as Devant Notre-Dame, in front of the cathedral, and he says he will sell romances. And it's quite an interesting thing that although it's those university books for which this is famous, they are clearly dealing with literary texts as well, and it's that aristocratic audience which they're capturing here. When we go down, we're going to go down in a moment down to the university area, and the clientele is going to change, but here it's very, very aristocratic. Now somewhere down here, and I don't know where they were, was Richard de Montbaston, who was a licensed bookseller and an illuminator. And there is a roman de la rose in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Sandra has prepared rather kinky little photographs of it. And in the tax records, his wife, Jean, is listed as illuminatrix. In other words, illuminator, female form. So he owns the bookshop, and he's probably an illuminator himself, and his wife is a registered, a licensed illuminator living somewhere down here. And in this Roman de la Rose in the Bibliothèque Nationale, there's a picture of a man and a woman both illuminating a manuscript, and that must be them. I mean, it's extraordinary that we have the name of a woman and a very, very distinctive style. He's not a terribly good artist, but they're very, very recognizable.
And what's interesting about the picture is how they're working on choir by choir, bifolio by folio, and like hanging them out to dry, like almost on a clothesline, as they work on them together on these little pulpits. So it's really fascinating. And on the next page, one of them, she is mixing colors, and he is working on the miniatures.
But clearly, what happened? I mean, what presumably happened is, if you ordered a book, initially you'd have gone to the parchmenter, but by the 14th century or end of the 13th century, you go to the bookshop, you go to the libraire, and you commission a manuscript. Now, he may or may not have been the scribe, but you'd go into the shop. They might have had second-hand books for sale. They'd have been running along the front here. Say they lived behind, 3-story houses behind, little shops along the front, along both sides. You go into the shop and you commission a book. And the bookseller may have been the scribe. He may have written it himself. Adam, living here, probably was a scribe, may have written it, but he then subcontracts out the illumination. So they may take it then across the street. I mean, they all live down here on both sides, and they also live down up the Rue Saint-Jacques where we're going. So you would order a book. You discuss the price, of course, the number of pictures, what you wanted, a length of time. Your contract would be with the bookseller, not with the scribe. And the bookseller would then go around the different illuminators in these unbound choirs, dividing up the book between them. So what looks to us as historians of manuscripts like collaboration between different artists in a single book, they're not really collaborating or not consciously doing so. They're merely subcontracting it out to the illuminator. And we now look at a manuscript and you say, this is an amazing work by the Boucicaut master. He's got an originality, a cycle of illustrations never done before, something absolutely new. Not really. He is just filling in the spaces that were left for him by the bookseller. The bookseller is the one who's deciding what is to be illustrated, where the pictures are to come, and will often write in it what the subjects are going to be. So the artist may be very, very good, but the originality, the decisions were not made by the artist, but were made by the bookseller.
And these images of bookmaking, like the choirs in the Montbaston Roman de la Rose, or a famous poem I'm going to tell you about, only makes sense when you sort of are here in the streets of Paris and you realize where they lived and how they did that. Can I do the poem now?
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah.
There's a famous poem that we now understand better, which is in a famous Bible for the King of France, Charles V, the Bible that's in The Hague. And it says, they write at the end, I have never before seen a Bible so adorned with pictures designed and made by one hand, for which he has made many comings and goings, night and day, through the streets of Paris, and the rain fell on his head as he was doing this. So to get this image of this illuminator carrying these choirs through these very streets as the rain fell on his head. I'll pass this around. The part of the poem is in red.
Yeah, well, the patron of this, of course, lived down there. You can just see the spire of the Sainte-Chapelle from here. So patron lives there, bookseller lives here, illuminators live partly here, partly over in the Rue des Illuminateurs.
And the scribe of that is Raoul d'Orléans, who lives right here, right on this street.
I think, as far as I recall, Raoul d'Orléans is actually here in the Rue of Notre-Dame.
So he's the scribe of the king.
Somewhere down here, and I don't know exactly where, in the mid-15th century was Guy Le Munier, also one of the 4 registered booksellers of the university. He's documented here in 1450, and he died in 1455. My guess is maybe, for the moment, let's assume he's over the other side. I don't actually know where he was. He's within 30 feet of where we're standing. But when he dies in 1455, we know about this because an inventory is made of his possessions. So we know exactly what was in the shop, what was in the bookshop. And the fascinating thing there is that there are a series of books of hours which are described as written and prepared, but clearly not illuminated. So by 1455, by the mid-15th century, just beginning of the period of printing, you could go into the shop and he would have manuscripts ready, partly ready, but ready to be adapted. So they're written and prepared. One was described, a particularly large book of hours, was then sold after his death by his executors to another bookseller in the street here called Jean Guimier. But the written and prepared presumably are not illuminated. So presumably you go in, you choose the book, you choose what kind of illustrations you want, and you come back and do it. He also had among his possessions a marble dish for mixing colours, so clearly illumination could happen there. And he has a pot of blue paint valued at 8 shillings. So quite interesting. Blue is the expensive colour. When the Duc de Berry died in 1416, his inventory also included a quantity of blue paint. So blue's the valuable one. Somewhere in this street, Jacques de Besançon lived. He is that illuminator who, in the past, you'll be familiar with the style, we used to muddle up with Maître François. He's clearly, there's these very, very distinctive Parisian illumination of the 15th century, absolutely characteristic style, pale yellows, a wonderful pale green, bright orange paint, mercuric sulfide they're using here. And Jacques de Besançon is a very, very recognizable painter. He lived somewhere, he lived right here in this street. But Maître François, with whom he's often confused and whose hands are very, very similar, was presumably François Barbier, who is an illuminator who was living round the corner here on the Pont Notre-Dame. So they're within striking distance of each other. And of course, eventually, as I mentioned before, Simon Vostre owned this house here. His wife was called Geneviève Pelletier, and the Pelletiers were a well-known family of bookbinders. So presumably he marries into the business and then sets up his shop somewhere around here, which is called the sign of St. John the Evangelist. Simon Vostre, the other great printer of early books of ours, was just around the corner there. And I happen to have a colophon somebody gave me years ago from one of the Vostre books of no great importance, but he gives his address here. Verad here. Verad's around the corner, and he described himself as Antoine Verad, libraire, who's living in Paris, and he says devant la rue Notre-Dame, à l'image de Saint Jean l'Évangéliste. So he's living in front of the street. Now he's actually registered just around the corner there by the entrance to where you go into the Sainte-Chapelle. So I assume when he says he's in front of the street of Notre-Dame, he's not actually in the street, he's just on the corner there. And that's the first time in 500 years that page has been back to the site where it was made. Where we are at the moment is on the Petit Pont, the little bridge. Now there was a bridge here since Roman times, so this is really, I mean, these two bridges are the oldest ones. The first stone bridge on this site was built in 1175, so they've already opened up the street there, and within 6 years they built a stone bridge over here. One of the problems is, do you remember in January of last year, there were floods here in Paris, and the people said they've never had floods like that before. Well, of course, the river, bubbling over the bank. Absolute nonsense. It happens all the time in the Middle Ages, and the bridge on which we are standing was washed away a number of times, including in 1393, when it was rebuilt by levying a tax on the Jews, and then in January, 29th of January 1408, there was another one of those winter floods, and it was completely washed away a second time. And the interest of that is that there are two books of ours, one in the Bodleian, and part of one of which you'll see with Sandra in an hour's time. There it is. It's her little bookmark made from it, that contains an inscription saying this book was made in Paris in the months when the bridges fell. So presumably this is something that matters to that illuminator. And it's illuminated by the Boucicaut master, the Mazarin master, close to the Boucicaut master, whoever that was, and we don't know who he was, but since the falling of the bridges clearly matters to him, my guess is he's one of the illuminators who's working on the bridges here. That may actually in the end be a clue as to the identity of who that painter was. I also photocopied, and Sandra has duplicated various a couple of pictures from books of ours. This, for example, this is what I think is one of the finest illuminations of the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, Sandra doesn't own it. This is from the hours of it's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is from the hours of Etienne Chevalier, illuminated probably in Paris, around about in the mid-1450s, and it shows the descent of the Holy Ghost on the city of Paris, with Notre-Dame in the background. And it's got what to me is absolutely fantastic thing where the sky here, the Holy Ghost is coming through the sky somewhere up just there, and as it enters our world you get ripples on the floor of heaven. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary artistic conceit, but the point is this is painted from just down there about where those trees are, and he's looking up to where we're standing. So we are we are exactly here by the bridge here, in which you can see where the houses are. I mean, it's quite an interesting pass around. Interesting. Well, that's the same again. And there's the one from the Très Riche. Have you got that?
I haven't.
Yeah. And a little bit earlier, this, of course, this famous image, one of the greatest images in all of art, once again, does not belong to Sandra. This is from the calendar of the Très Riche of the Duc de Berry, which has these 11 pictures of his houses. The 12th one was never finished. And the Duc de Berry's house was down before where the crane is, but on the left-hand side there on the river. So this is the view looking up across the river, not quite as far as where we are, but where they're harvesting is the far side over there, and the river, the city side along here where the rows of houses are is down where and these little trees, you see that little row of trees, those are those trees down there. The trees are still there. And then there's also another book of ours made in Paris, Parisian book of ours, in the Rylands Library in Manchester, with another view of exactly the same period. So photographed from down there, looking up to where we are. And here once again is the bridge, is the Petit Pont, with these half-timbered houses, 2 levels, standing exactly where we are now. Now we're now going to go up the what turns into the Rue Saint-Jacques, and in crossing over here we're going into the university area, and that mixture in the book trade between the aristocracy here, the romances, the great texts for the royal family, the royal books and so on are all made down there. And once we're over on the left side, we're going into the university area, and down here as you will know is the Sorbonne. We're not going quite as far as that, and one block beyond the Sorbonne is the Dominican house of Saint-Jacques. And that became tremendously important in the production of literary and religious texts. Thomas Aquinas was publishing his books in the Rue Saint-Jacques, and the great booksellers, many of the great booksellers, including the family of Song, who were down here somewhere in the Rue Saint-Jacques for many generations, are producing and publishing books for the university, and they're doing them on this PCA system, this way where the universities have these authorized exemplars which they lend out to the booksellers who copy them.
What I didn't say before is we could never do this, in spite of how brilliant Christopher is, without Richard and Mary Rouse, who have combed the documents and who have written a book called Manuscripts and Their Makers in Paris. And from those documents you can learn which house everyone lived in. And now Mary has written a sequel to it, which takes Paris illuminators from 1520 to 1789. Also with what happens to the book trade in the almost modern world. So, yeah, Christopher.
Yeah. I'm very happy to acknowledge absolutely, totally, that I've got nothing original to say. It all comes from Richard and Mary Rouse. Though I would correct slightly what Sandra said. In many cases, we don't know exactly where they live. We only know approximately, because at different stages, in the 1290s, the book trade was subject to the municipal tax of Paris. So everybody had to give their occupations and the name of and of course there were no numbers in the streets. So they'll give the name of the street where they live, but they don't say exactly where they are. And it's only and then the licensed booksellers were exempt from tax. I mean, terribly French. And so the moment they become a libraire principal, a major principal illuminator of Paris, they disappear from the tax records. Yes. So it's a nightmare from our point of view. You get the people we really want to know about, like, the Boucicaut master presumed to be Jacques Kern and so on. The moment they become licensed illuminators, they vanish from the record unless they get caught in lawsuits or they sell the houses. And if they sell the house, they often say they define their house by the name of their neighbor. Now, we are, as you saw, came along, we come into the Rue de la Parcheminerie. Now, France is famous for changing the names of the streets. Every time, even in our lifetime, they change them in names of national heroes. But there is a good medieval name that was used in the Middle Ages. They referred to it. The street was originally called the Rue des Écrivains, and it's called in Vico Scriptorum, in the Street of the Scribes, as early as 1209. So very, very early on. So while Alexander was up there, some of the scribes lived down here. Now it's cheaper to live here. The bookseller has to live somewhere where he picks up the market, but you cross the river, you come down, it's not far, you've seen how far it is to walk, so not very far, but we're outside the main bit of Paris. We're still within the walls of Paris. But it's also called the Rue de la Parcheminerie, which also, presumably, the parchmenters, again, these are the booksellers. These are the cheaper end of the booksellers, and many of the illuminators actually live down here. And the one that the one we can localize absolutely is Perrin Remier, who's recorded as an illuminator in Paris from 1368 until his death in about 1420, and he lived right here, absolutely on the corner here, because we have the description of the house being on the corner of the street, on the far corner of the street by Saint-Séverin, which of course is the church behind here, which was where the Illuminators Guild was based. So that was the parish church of the Illuminators. And he lived and worked here. And he was an illuminator and a panel painter. And he was painting panels for the chapel of Louis d'Orléans, for example, in 1396. But there is a pèlerinage de la vie humaine, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, in which his name appears. And there are two illuminators that work in that book, and there is uncertainty among the art historians as to which of them is Perrin Remier and which of them is Renaud de Monte, the other name that appears in there. But what is so fascinating is that in the tax records, Renaud de Monte lived next door. So he was the other side. So he was just the far side of where the coffee shop is down there, saying Alexander. So these two painters working together on a manuscript. And Renaud was one of the principal booksellers, one of the libraires, one of the four licensed booksellers, and his house was called the sign of the star, the signe d'étoile. Must have been exactly there. But what's interesting about him is he sold 13 manuscripts to the Duc de Berry. And it wasn't until I walked around this in preparation for this last night, I realized, of course, from that picture in the Très Richelieu, that the Duc de Berry's estate was on the other side here. So the Duc de Berry's come out through his back gate, walked out here, he's come across a bookseller, and he's bought 13 manuscripts. So he probably actually came in there himself, right there, in the 15th century. He's probably doing it himself, or somebody from the household is doing it. So it brings in something very, very, very close. Now, after
location. They say in real estate.
Remier has this assumed Remier. Remier or his neighbour have this very distinctive style, and Sandra has a miniature by him, or by one of the candidates for him at the moment. So those of you who are coming back for drinks afterwards, she can show you can buy it, but you can buy one it's a hotel. I think Sandra should she should have booked it for lunch. You know, we could have sat in the very building where Remier worked. But after his death, in 1469, his house here was occupied by Nicolas Levenier, described as a parchmenter, and again, clearly very successful. And he then bought the house on the other side of the street, so the other side of towards Saint-Séverin. So he owned both sides here, so he got them on both ways. And and that was called this house was called the sign of the Fleur de Lis. One of the descriptions of it describes how the house here shared with its neighbour, which I assume is one along there, a little garden at the back. And I'm delighted to see the garden is still there. There is the little greenery, which was the garden, the background garden of Nicolas Venier, the parchmenter. And in 1490, Levenier was caught for selling unlicensed parchment, and several of his neighbours were involved in this scandal. They were all fined an enormous amount, but it was going on this little street. They're still selling parchment. Now we're going to move around the corner here into the Rue de what's now called Boute-Brie. This was the this is a corruption, a survival of the Rue Ehrenburg de Brie, as it's called in the Middle Ages. So it's the same name, but in 600 years it's got a little bit shorter. And this was opened up. This was a single street originally, say by 1209. This street was opened in 1250. So clearly there was access down here, some walkway down beside the church. This street along here, the convent of Saint-Jacques is one block over in that direction. You must imagine this is a narrow little medieval street in the late 13th century with half-timbered houses, probably 2 or 3 stories high, probably narrower than this. There would have been about, by my calculation, about 5 houses along each side. We know some of them we can pin down almost exactly because we have the names of their neighbours, and you can calculate roughly how many neighbours they must have had. And 4 houses, at least 3 or 4 houses along from the far end here. So my guess is about here is where Honoré lived. Now Honoré, documented here from 1289 until about 1313, is probably the greatest 13th century illuminator. He signed that famous decretum now in Tours, in which his name appears together with that of his son-in-law Richard of Verdun, and it has that quintessential high quality Parisian work with those swaying figures. It's absolutely magnificent illumination, and all booksellers, Sandra and others, of course, have hoped to find works by Honoré. There's the famous Somme le Roi, must be a royal manuscript, and in the British Library in London, attributed to Honoré, and then there are a group of other books in that general style. And one of the things he clearly specialised in the signed work is canon law. So although this is incredibly grand, it's church law. I mean, it's not aristocratic. It's probably for bishops. It's for people who are coming down to grand visitors to the Sorbonne down there, coming to Saint-Jacques, coming down here. He lives right there. And in 1296, we have payments in which he's making books for the king. So he's clearly, I mean, he's a fantastic illuminator, and he's illuminating for the royal family. And the manuscript in Tours, as I say, also mentions his son-in-law, Richard of Verdun, and there are a number of members of the Verdun family living around here. And Richard was originally living in Honoré's own house, so he marries the daughter. Then clearly he does well enough out of it. He buys the house next door but one. So that's my calculation roughly as to where they are. So he must have been down about there. And then there's a group of books, we don't know for sure, in that kind of Honoré style in the early 13th century, who were presumably by him. But he'd moved by 1296. And his house, somewhere in there, was described as being between those of the bookbinder Pierre de Vaumondat on one side and Nicolas, the widow of the illuminator Robert Lefouy, on the other. So I don't know which is which, but clearly there's a bookbinder and an illuminator working together somewhere down there. Now, almost more important is on this side, more or less opposite, is Jean Pucelle. This is where he lived, right here, and Pucelle is the greatest, probably greater still. It's a Chinese, what is it, Chinese? No, it's a nail shop, I don't know what it is. But anyway, Pucelle is here, and of course he is the artist of the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, now in the Metropolitan Museum, this wonderful grisaille manuscript, absolutely fantastic quality. He is documented living here from 1319 until 1334 on the west side of the Rue Ehrenburg de Brie, opposite the house formerly occupied by Honoré. So right here was the greatest illuminated manuscript probably produced in Paris in the 13th century. But what is so interesting, and it's never occurred to me till preparing this, is what a lot of those Pucelle manuscripts are of Dominican use. The Dominican, including the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, which is described as being of the order of preachers, and the convent of Saint-Jacques, there it is. I mean, it's within sight. That is why, or one reason why, the Dominican side is so important right here. Now there are other...
And we have a Pucelle group book that we just acquired that's on display in
which you'll see, yeah.
In this Paris exhibit.
Yeah, it is. I have to tell you, it's not by Pucelle, but bet you, I virtually guarantee it's by one of the illuminators in this street. So it will be either by Robert Lefroy, who was living over there, or it could be by Geoffroy Le Lorraine, of whom we have no work, who was living on the...
Now we do.
was living on the west side of the street, who in 1339 bought the house next door to that of Peronelle La Pucelle, whom we assume is the widow of Pucelle. That's the a couple of years after he died. So presumably, my guess is, I'm going to guess, if Pucelle is here, it was here. Geoffroy was about here. Here he is. He's working on a. And described then as being next door but one to Jean Massy, illuminator, whom I'm guessing was down by Body Minute on the corner there, recorded as an illuminator till 1335, and who came to Paris from Avignon. So we know quite a lot about his background. He'd been working for the papal court there, came up to Paris clearly, where the money is, sets himself up there, and Massy and Pucelle are both named as illuminators in the famous Billing Bible of 1327 in the Bibliothèque Nationale. So, next door but one, here they are doing this Dominican-style book within striking there's one shop between them. I mean, it's so kind of intimate. And also on the west side, and my assumption is along the other side, was Jean Lenoir. Now, he is the closest follower in style to Pucelle. He does the Belleville Breviary, which also Bibliothèque Nationale often used to be attributed to Pucelle. He's living across the street, and he was documented here from 1332 onwards and lived until 1371. He was joined in 1358 by his daughter, Bourgeot, also lived in the same house, who was an illuminator too, or lumineuresse, she's called. So clearly, father and son are working together, illuminating manuscripts. And what's so interesting about him is that he is documented right through in a series of manuscripts up to the 1370s in the French royal court, working for the Duc de Berry, working for various women around the court. And among the surviving manuscripts, there's only one illuminator that appears in all those things, and it has to be Jean Lenoir himself. So therefore, we not only know where he lives, but this is a François Avril discovery. We've got him nailed now. And he is the illuminator of the Pitizeur of the Duc de Berry, among other things. So illuminated here, 100 yards to the back door of the Duc de Berry's house, and the hours of Jean of Navarre, which forms a chapter of the book I've just written, to which Sandra kindly alluded, which was made for the Queen of Navarre, the daughter of the King of France, and has an immensely complicated history, and belonged also, after her death, to the Duc de Berry, but must have been illuminated right here, absolutely on the spot. My guess is you probably, buying a book, if you want a book of ours, you probably came up here and you called on the parchment shops, the illuminators, the bookshops on the corner. Just around the corner here, beyond where Remier lived, just around the corner there, it's still a bookshop. I mean, I noticed it's still a second-hand bookshop. So you could probably come up here in the 14th century. There would be second-hand books for sale. There'd be parchment sellers, in other words, stationers in the modern sense, people organising the book trade. There were scribes living around here, scribes moonlighting from the university, and the very, very expensive illuminators lived here. So Pucelle and Honoré and Jean Lenoir. In a space as small as that, this is the most sacred site in all of Paris. And here we are. And I bet none of these people know it. Yeah.
Were they in good terms, or did they?
Question is, were they in good terms? We don't know the answer. One of the things, of course, is if you, as I say, we often, as art historians, you look and you see collaboration in a single manuscript between two great painters. You see the Boucicaut master and the Bedford master are working together in a book, and you think they were the two great rivals. How are they working together? Well, of course, it wasn't like that. The bookshop has the unwritten quires. The written quires with the spaces left for the illumination. And he pops around the corner here and he pops in on Honoré and says, I need 20 pictures. Honoré says, I'm really busy, but I can do 3. So he said, all right then, what Sandra describes as going through the streets. So he pops up a bit to Jean Ledoir. He said, I got nothing to do at the moment. I'll take another 12, and so on. And these are in loose gatherings. So what looks to us like collaboration of artists very often is no more than that the choirs have been distributed among them. And when you collate a manuscript, you go through and you sort out how the different choirs held together, even in the small illumination. The changes of hand among the illumination will occur between the choirs. So it's not till you really get the structure clear that you can see exactly how they've handed these things out a choir at a time. So the question of whether they're on friendly terms with each other, not necessarily. It wasn't their problem. They needn't even have met each other, except they all lived together. They all go to church in Saint-Séverin. Of course, they all knew each other.
Christopher,
Yeah.
the leaves were already, the marginal decoration had already been made, or had.
Question is whether
That wasn't
marginal
done by the
decoration.
master.
My assumption is that marginal decoration probably had not been made because the changes of marginal decoration usually happens between the choirs. But clearly from that bookseller down in the Rue Notre-Dame, who on his death has got books written but not illuminated, they were probably partly illuminated. But you know, a book of hours sometimes has borders all the way through, sometimes has borders only on the principal pages, sometimes has full borders running the whole way around the pages. That was a choice of the customer. It was a matter of how much you were prepared to pay. So if they wrote it in advance, then they left spaces, and the customer said, I want a cheap one. So he said, well, we won't do borders then. People often wonder how we value manuscripts today, and I'm afraid it's exactly the same as they did in the Middle Ages. You count up the amount of illumination and you multiply it out, and a book with 3 miniatures is worth a tenth of a book with 30 miniatures, and a book with 300 miniatures is worth, that's how it worked then and how it worked now.
But it wasn't necessarily a chronological order that the marginal decoration was already made and then it was sent to the, because that's what I always thought.
No, it is
the
assumption is that the writing is done first.
Yeah.
What is so interesting about illuminated charters, both now and then, is clearly in charters they would do the borders first and fill in the writing later. It's very odd, but normally you do when you have unfinished manuscripts, the writing is done first, spaces are left for the illumination. And where they write in, which they do particularly in Paris, they write in the title of the miniature to go in. So they say Les Rois, or whatever it is for the picture for Sext. That is because the exemplar is no longer there. So it's left the bookshop and it's come down to the illuminator, and he hasn't got the exemplar in front of him. So he needs a reminder as to what the subject is going to be. And the initials. And the initials have little guide letters written in, and sometimes they get them wrong. And it hasn't, and when printing came in, it didn't really change. Printing came in very, very fast in Paris. Peter Schoeffer, collaborator of Gutenberg in Mainz, was selling books in Paris on the Pont Notre-Dame, over which we're going to walk in a moment. So they were selling Gutenberg press books here in the 1460s. Very, very interesting how fast printing came. And of course, those printers, Faustre and Ferrard and Hardouin and so on, were working principally over the other side, not so much over here. Were working around the cathedral, picking up that royal aristocratic trade. But the university books were done here and in the Rue Saint-Jacques. They were all down there. And the little kind of, Sandra has many businesses, but the text manuscript section is Rue Saint-Jacques. The books of hours section is mostly over in the cathedral, unless they're religious. Dominicans or Franciscans.
Bibles, where do you think?
Affordable Bibles, I would guess, are probably aristocratic. It's often said those little tiny, what they call university Bibles, probably those are not for university students. They're too expensive for students, but they're for people. Maybe a student, when he's finished his course, buys one and goes home with it. But they're used a lot by the friars. So maybe, actually, Dominicans would have had them made here. Don't know. But,
Did the illuminators have an organisation which would have records of what they
Well, there were guilds of illuminators, particularly of which no records survive. We have a little bit of them in Bruges, where the Guild of St. Luke was the illuminators, and we have partial records there, so sometimes you can pick up the names, but they belong to some kind of, I mean, to be a licensed. The trouble is, once you're licensed, oddly, you disappear from the record because there's the great tax advantage of it, and it's only really when they're in trouble with the law that they get picked up. So Jean Lenoir, who lived down there, before he lived here, was actually over on the right bank as a young man, and he gets caught one day in a lawsuit. One of the painters loses some money, and it's found outside where he was staying, and it's rather unfairly, it seems to me, unsatisfactory evidence, but he was charged with stealing it. Whether he did or didn't, I don't know, but anyway, did well enough to move down here. But that actually is picking up the first record of him. And the same, of course, applies to many figures of medieval history, that you could document them only when they go through the law courts. So that doesn't mean that they were particularly bad, but just that's when they get picked up. So when they were selling unlicensed parchment here, a whole lot of them were clearly in on the act. They were all doing it, and they all get caught and fined at the same time. But it gives us their names. And these are real people. I mean, it's, of course they are. It actually happened. Do you want to say anything? You want to take over now? I mean,
no,
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things you just touched on. I mean, one of the things you just touched on was the printing trade. I mean, we really know where all of them are. You saw the colophon. We have a couple of printed books of ours in this little exhibit in the shop. But they clearly start to really stake their name with the place at the sign of Saint whatever, so that you see a book in your friend's house, and on the first page it says, Philippe Gaucher at the sign of blah, and it's not just the name of the house. It's like at the Pont Notre-Dame, the second house from the left. So they're advertising in their books, much as Penguin might put their address on the back cover now, or their website at least. Yeah, I think it makes it all really real. It's great.
And Paris was the biggest city in the Western world by far. I mean, this was the richest, beyond comparison, the most important city in all of Europe. So not only the royal court, the money, the university, the administration of the church, and this huge operation. Everybody came here. So you get the illuminators coming in, the one on the corner there, say, came in from Avignon, but painters coming in from Bruges and Italy and going back and, coming back here. I mean, it's a scale so far beyond London or Rome or Florence. Venice, of course, becomes big, but later Paris is the center. And really, if you're buying a manuscript, Paris is an option. A Paris book is likely. I mean, they're not all good, but Paris is the real center as to where the good stuff is. We know quite a lot about the book trade in Rouen, in Normandy, and it did occur to us that if this kind of thing is fun, we could all meet together in a year's time, and I'll take you around the Cour des Libraires in Rouen, which is quite well documented too. Also obviously on the Seine, and big commercial, mercantile city. But Paris has the court. And it's the court money and the court patronage and the Duc de Berry at the back door and the king over there. That's what kicks the whole thing off. And everybody imitates the royal family.
And then, of course, you probably know this, that in 1420, with the end of the reign of Charles VI, and that Paris has an English regent, 100 Years' War, et cetera, that the book trade kind of collapses in Paris. And one of the very interesting things that, like, say, François Avril and Nicole Reynaud did with, Manuscrits à Peinture, but many other people have now worked on, is how these styles that were fixed in time at 1420 in Paris went out to the different places. What happened to Parisian art in Amiens or in Troyes or in Rouen? And that itself is interesting. But Christopher's quite right. It all originates here with a certain confluence of circumstances, patronage, wealth, etc.
The question is how big. It's the Duc de Berry arriving. The size of the population. Different people have worked out. I can never remember figures. I'm going to invent and say hundreds of thousands, but not. But most medieval cities are tiny. Yes. Some we think of Siena or something crazy. You find it was 5,000 people or something. I mean, the smallness of it. But Paris was over 100,000. So big city.
It was still smaller than Rome in the Roman Empire, which was 1 million.
Actually, I don't know whether it was more than Rome in Roman times. There's a question.
Smaller, yeah.
Was it? Yeah. Actually, Rome
was 1 million.
Was it? Well, I don't know whether. Actually, I suspect Rome was bigger.
Yeah.
I suspect this is of course traditionally the second Rome. So,
and then your map, is 150 years later almost. This is Paris in 1552, I think. But surprisingly medieval. I mean, you can still track the streets and the houses.
Now, my advice is, I've talked now for an hour and a quarter. I'm not sure whether Sandra's offering champagne, but it's something like that. I suggest you go back and get your money's worth. That would be my advice. And you can buy a little miniature by Remier for not a lot of money. Yeah.